On October 9, 1980, Schuylkill Mall opened on a hill above Frackville, Pennsylvania, spreading 800,000 square feet of polished tile and neon light across a landscape of old coal country. 115 storefronts filled its corridors, 3,200 cars filled its lot, and three anchor giants, Sears, Kmart, and Hess's, pulled shoppers from every town in the anthracite region. Today, at that same address, Schuylkill Mall is gone, replaced by a windowless warehouse and the low hum of diesel engines. How did a place this large disappear so completely? Before the mall, there was the mountain, and before the mountain, there was the coal. If you had stood on that hill above Frackville, Pennsylvania, in the late 1970s and looked out across Schuylkill County, you would have seen the outline of a landscape shaped by more than a century of anthracite mining. Culm banks the color of old ash, breaker houses standing like abandoned churches along the ridgelines, and small towns stitched tightly around the shafts that once fed them. This was the heart of Pennsylvania's anthracite region, where entire generations grew up to the sound of a colliery whistle, marking the beginning and end of a shift, and where the phrase coal country was not a metaphor, but a home address written on an envelope. By the late 1970s, though, that world was already 30 years into a long and painful goodbye. Demand for anthracite, the hard, clean-burning coal that had heated much of the northeastern United States and helped fire its steel mills, had collapsed after the Second World War, as homes switched to oil and natural gas, and heavy industry moved elsewhere. The Knox Mine disaster of 1959, when the Susquehanna River broke through the roof of a mine near Pittston and drowned the workings below, effectively ended deep anthracite mining as a large-scale industry across the region. What remained were shrinking towns, aging populations, and a question that no one in Harrisburg or Washington seemed to have a clear answer to. If not coal, then what? You could see that question written on Lehigh Avenue in downtown Frackville, and on the older shopping streets of nearby Pottsville, Ashland, and Shenandoah. These were the places that had defined regional commerce for the better part of the 20th century. Narrow storefronts, family-owned shoe shops, a Pomeroy's department store in Pottsville that had anchored downtown for generations, movie houses, five and dimes, drugstores where the pharmacist knew your father by name. In the 1970s, those streets were not yet empty, but the paint was peeling around the doorframes. Fewer young couples pushed strollers past the shop windows on a Saturday afternoon, and the parking meters seemed to run a little slower. Meanwhile, the rest of the country was quietly rearranging itself around them. The long stretches of Interstate 81, running through central Pennsylvania, had been completed and opened by the middle of the decade, and suddenly a hilltop in Schuylkill County was no longer a remote place. It was a place you could reach from Harrisburg, Wilkes-Barre, or Scranton in under an hour by car. Personal automobiles had become the default way American families moved through the world. Young couples were leaving the tight brick row homes of the coal patch towns and building split-level houses on former farmland along the county roads. Wherever those families landed, they wanted somewhere to shop that was clean, climate-controlled, and open on Sunday afternoons. That somewhere already existed, in principle. Back in 1956, an Austrian-American architect named Victor Gruen had opened Southdale Center in Edina, Minnesota, the first fully enclosed climate-controlled shopping mall in the United States. Gruen had imagined it as a kind of European town square with a roof pulled over it, a gathering place for community life in a country that was rapidly losing its old ones. What he had actually invented, however, was a formula, and by the mid-1970s, that formula was spreading across the country like a controlled fire. Every mid-sized region in America seemed to be getting one. The only question left in Schuylkill County was when its turn would come and who would build it. The answer arrived from a company called Crown American Corporation, headquartered a few hours to the west in the hills of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Crown American had been quietly building shopping centers across small city America for years, and when its executives looked at Schuylkill County, they saw something the local newspapers had been slower to name. A market of roughly 150,000 people, sitting at a highway crossroads, still without a modern enclosed mall of their own. In 1977, the pieces began to fall into place. In a land swap that would later be remembered as a turning point for the county, the Schuylkill County Municipal Authority handed over about 75 acres of hilltop in Newcastle Township in exchange for 440 acres of land that included the Kaufman Dam. On paper, it was an exchange of parcels. In practice, it was clearing the way for something the region had never seen before. Underneath that transaction was a quieter promise. A promise that the future of Schuylkill County would not be written in coal, but in retail. That the next chapter would happen up here on this hill, not down there on Lehigh Avenue. And in the crowded public hearings that were about to fill church basements and township meeting rooms across the county, not everyone was ready to sign that promise. If Schuylkill County was going to bet its future on a shopping mall, the man taking that bet was Frank Pasquarilla. By the late 1970s, Pasquarilla had built Crown American Corporation, run out of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, into one of the most active mall developers in the country. A family firm that had grown, storefront by storefront, into a company with a recognizable signature. Crown American specialized in enclosed regional malls, dropped into small and mid-sized cities that the bigger national developers had passed over. Schuylkill was to be its newest jewel, and Pasquarilla's people arrived in the county with the calm confidence of a company that had done this many times before. The first drawings called for a single-story enclosed center of 586,000 square feet at a projected cost of somewhere between $40 and $50 million. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that figure sits closer to $214 million, the kind of investment that had never before landed in one place in the anthracite region. The plan promised 4 department store anchors, dozens of specialty shops, a food court, and a movie theater, all wrapped in the sealed, climate-controlled envelope that had become the standard language of American retail before a single wall could go up. However, the project had to survive its opponents. In the church halls and township meeting rooms of the county, a small but determined environmental group, calling itself the General Association to Stop Pollution. Most people simply called them by their initials, argued that a development of this size would pollute the nearby reservoir and reshape the drainage of an entire watershed. Local merchants along Lehigh Avenue in Frackville had a different worry. They understood, without needing a consultant to tell them, that a mall on the hill would pull shoppers away from their aging downtowns. On the evening of January 28, 1978, roughly 100 citizens crowded into a zoning hearing to weigh the future of the hilltop. Most of the voices in the room were cautious, and some of them were angry. The developers pressed forward anyway. Excavation on the site began on September 11, 1978, even as the legal fights over environmental review continued to work their way through the courts. In April of 1979, the last serious challenge was turned aside at a state hearing in Harrisburg, and the path was finally clear. What was not clear yet was the ground itself. Standing before the Frackville Rotary Club on the evening of November 8, 1979, a Crown American executive named Paul Brennan admitted that the crews were fighting through rock that was, in his careful words, much harder than anticipated to blast through. In a small detail almost lost to history, Brennan also mentioned that the company had drilled test borings, hoping to hit a profitable seam of coal beneath the site. They found none. The mountain was giving them nothing but stone. By the middle of 1980, the numbers on the blueprint had grown. The building had swelled to 800,000 square feet. The anchor count had risen to 4, and about 70 tenants, a mix of national chains, regional favorites, and small independent shops, had signed leases and were quietly readying their storefronts for opening day. That day came on October 9th, 1980. It was a Thursday, and by all accounts, a beautiful one. The sky over Frackville clear, and the temperature settling into the mid-60s by mid-morning. The North Schuylkill High School marching band played "This Land Is Your Land," the notes carrying out across the freshly paved parking lot and up into the hills that had watched all of this take shape. The organizers had gone as far as inviting the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, to attend the grand opening. He did not come. The country was less than a month away from a presidential election, and Carter had other places to be. But his absence took nothing away from the crowd. People arrived from Pottsville and Shenandoah, from Mahanoy City and Ashland, many of them dressed as if for church. The promises made from the podium that morning were enormous by the standards of Schuylkill County. Brown American projected first-year sales of $39.1 million, rising to $42.5 million in year two. The mall would create roughly 1,200 permanent jobs. It would raise the local tax base by around 150%. It offered 3,200 parking spaces, and, in the phrase, the promotional materials could not stop repeating, a building that was beautifully heated and air-conditioned throughout. The people who stood in the line that snaked out of the doors of Hess's that morning, mothers holding the hands of small children, teenagers in flared jeans, retired mine workers who had never imagined shopping in a place like this, did not know what they were walking into. They only knew that something new had come to the coal region, and it belonged to them. What none of them could have known was that they were also walking into the opening morning of an entire era, and that these first bright years would burn faster than anyone standing on that pavement could have imagined. Once the doors opened, Schuylkill Mall did not take long to become the center of gravity for an entire county. On a weekday morning in the early 1980s, you could stand at the crossing of the main corridor and watch the 4 anchor stores pull their own separate rivers of foot traffic through the building. At one end stood Sears, freshly relocated from downtown Pottsville and expanded to nearly 3 times its old floor space, offering roughly 200,000 items through its catalog counter and a 10-bay automotive service center that could handle the family car while the family shopped. Across from it, Kmart drew the value-conscious crowd with an unusually large home improvement section for the chain, a small hardware department where a retired coal foreman could still spend an afternoon comparing wrenches. Anchoring the eastern wing was Hess's department store, the Allentown-based chain that had become one of the most recognizable names in northeastern retail, famous for its perfume counters, its holiday windows, and the oversized strawberry pie served in its restaurants. Rounding out the original 4 was Weiss Markets, the Sunbury-based supermarket that gave the mall a daily life anchor, a full grocery under the same roof, where you could also buy a school dress and a car battery. The pool kept widening. In 1983, Pomeroy's, a beloved regional department store that had anchored downtown Pottsville for generations, closed its old flagship on Center Street and reopened inside Schuylkill Mall as a 5th full anchor. For many older shoppers, watching Pomeroy's move up the hill was the moment the balance finally tipped. The mall was no longer just a rival to the old downtowns. It had absorbed one of their most beloved names. 4 years later, in 1987, the York-based chain, the Bon Ton, bought Pomeroy's, hung its own signage above the same doors, and continued to run the store for the next 2 decades. Then in 1991, the discount pharmacy chain Far More opened as a 6th anchor, marking the mall's first real pivot toward the deep discount model that was beginning to dominate the American retail landscape. Between the anchors ran the corridors, and the corridors were packed. If you close your eyes and try to picture a peak-era American mall directory, You are picturing something very close to Schuylkill Mall in the mid-1980s and early 1990s. Walden Books and Record Town sat a few doors from each other, where a teenager could walk out with a paperback and a cassette on the same $20 bill. Spencer's Gifts glowed in blacklight halfway down the main corridor, its lava lamps turning slowly behind the glass. K. Jewelers and Claire's shared a stretch of hallway with Fashion Bug and KB Toys. There was a Radio Shack for the fathers, an Orange Julius for the kids, and an Endicott Johnson shoe store for the whole family. In the food court, Chick-fil-A shared space with not one but two separate McDonald's locations, alongside Franklin Family Restaurant for those who wanted to sit down and be waited on. At the far end, the United Artists Theater's marquee promised a first-run film every night of the week. The reason all of this held together was simple, and it was written on a roadmap. Schuylkill Mall sat almost exactly at the crossing of Interstate 81 and Pennsylvania Route 61, a location that turned it into a destination for both the people who lived in the coal region and the travelers who happened to be passing through. Truckers stopped for coffee on their way to Wilkes Barre. Families driving between Harrisburg and Scranton pulled off for lunch. Local shoppers came up the hill because it was the only enclosed mall within reasonable driving distance in any direction. On a good Saturday, the parking lot filled by mid-morning. Retired mine workers gathered in the food court over long, refilled cups of coffee, arguing about the Phillies and the Eagles. Families arrived from Ashland, Shenandoah, and Mahanoy City in station wagons and later minivans, splitting up at the main entrance and agreeing to meet back at the fountain in 2 hours. Teenagers claimed the benches outside the theater as their own, holding entire social lives together in the space of a single Saturday afternoon. The growth continued long enough to look permanent. As late as 1995, Sears expanded its store here by another 23,000 square feet, a strong signal from one of America's most cautious retailers that this hilltop in Schuylkill County still had room to grow. If you had asked any of the people walking those corridors what Schuylkill Mall meant to them, though, they would not have answered with square footage or sales projections. They would have told you about a first job folding sweaters at Walden Books, a grandmother who always ordered strawberry pie at Hess's, or a boy they met by the fountain on a snowy afternoon. The mall's real scale, in the end, was measured in something much smaller and much harder to replace. If you spent enough Saturdays at Schuylkill Mall in the 1980s and early 1990s, the building imprinted itself on your senses in a way no photograph could ever capture. You knew it, first, by smell. The warm salted butter perfume of Auntie Anne's soft pretzels drifted up from the food court and mixed with the buttered popcorn seeping out of the theater lobby, and both of them met the cool, floral cloud of tester perfumes hovering past the doors of Hess's cosmetics counter. Together, they formed a scent that belonged to nowhere else in the county. One that, for anyone who grew up in Frackville, still triggers a small ache whenever they catch a whiff of something like it in another mall somewhere else in America. Then there was the light. Overhead, banks of fluorescent tubes cast a steady, even glow that had almost no relationship to the weather outside, and that was part of the appeal. For a few hours you could pretend the wet, gray sky of a January afternoon in the coal region simply did not exist. The pink and blue neon of the Orange Julius sign threw its own colored halo across the corridor. The lights of K. Jewelers glinted off the display cases. All of it reflected softly off the beige and brown floor tiles that gave the walkways their characteristic warm hush. The sound was its own layer. Somewhere near the center of the building sat the fountain, its steady trickle audible in every quiet moment, coins glimmering on the bottom from every small wish that had ever been made there. Overhead, the mall's sound system played a soft rotation of the era's easy pop, Air Supply, Whitney Houston, The Carpenters, kept just quiet enough that no one really listened to it, but loud enough that its absence would have felt wrong. From the direction of KB Toys came the higher-pitched sound of children laughing, or occasionally weeping. For teenagers in Schuylkill County, the mall was a rite of passage. Friday afternoon, the last bell rang at North Schuylkill, Blue Mountain, or Shenandoah Valley, and by 4 o'clock, a certain number of them were already circling the corridors in loose packs, splitting a single orange Julius 3 ways to make it last longer, spraying novelty testers at Spencer's Gifts, flipping through the new releases at Record Town to see whether the cassette they had been waiting for had finally arrived. For a slightly older crowd, the mall was where first dates happened. 2 17-year-olds, both a little nervous, would split a red plastic basket of French fries at Franklin Family Restaurant, then walk over to United Artists Theaters for whatever was playing, and afterward drift through the corridors talking about the movie, until it was time to be picked up out front. A remarkable number of long marriages in Schuylkill County can be traced, if you ask the right questions, back to a Saturday night at that theater. For the families of miners, railroad workers, and the men and women who ran the small factories still hanging on in Mahanoy City, Girardville, and Ashland, the Saturday trip up to the mall was often the event of the week. It was where school shoes were bought before the fall term, where a father picked out his wife's birthday gift, because it was the only place still open late enough, where a grandmother finally got the winter coat she had been putting off for 2 seasons. It was the closest thing the coal region had to a shared living room. And then, before the mall officially opened its doors on winter mornings, there was another crowd nobody in the marketing brochure had planned for. Retirees from across the county, many of them widows, many of them former mine workers whose knees could no longer tolerate the outdoor cold, arrived at 7 or 7:30 and walked laps around the enclosed corridors, sneakers squeaking softly on the tile. Before the shops rolled up their gates for the morning, mall walking was never written into any lease agreement. But for hundreds of older people in Schuylkill County, it was one of the quiet reasons the building mattered. The people who worked there knew all of this. The women behind the perfume counters at Hess's could greet a regular customer by name and knew which fragrance she wore. The security guards understood exactly which teenagers were harmless loiterers and which needed a quiet word in a corner near the exit. And at Christmas, the whole place tipped over into something almost sacred. Santa Claus held court on a red velvet chair beside the central fountain, a line of children in wet snow boots trailing halfway down the corridor, string lights winding up every column, and the air slightly humid from 100 coats steaming dry in the warmth of the enclosed hall. All of this, the smell, the light, the sound, the small daily rituals, is what people mean now, 30 years later, when they say they missed them all. It is why the loss, when it finally came, would be so hard to name. Somewhere in the middle of the 1990s, quietly at first, something in this building began to change. The change did not arrive as a single event. It arrived the way weather changes on a mountain. You feel it in the pressure before you see it in the sky. And the first serious drop in the pressure came in 1995, when Hess's, the brightest anchor the mall had ever known, closed its doors here for good. For a generation of Schuylkill County shoppers, the closing of Hess's was almost impossible to process. Its perfume counters, its holiday windows, and its restaurant with the oversized strawberry pie had been part of the mall since opening day. The chain itself was in trouble on a scale no local manager could fix. The Allentown-based company had been struggling for years, was sold off in stages during the mid-1990s, and its name began disappearing from storefronts across Pennsylvania and the wider Northeast. When the doors at Schuylkill Mall finally closed for the last time, they closed on more than a store. They closed on a certain kind of American department store experience that had defined shopping in this region for 2 generations. The replacement that eventually moved into the Hess's space was called U.S. Factory Outlets, a discount operation that sold goods off tables and racks, without much attempt at atmosphere. The perfume counter and the pie were gone. The tiled floor and the tall ceilings remained. In hindsight, what happened in that corner of the building was not just a tenant change. It was a symbol. The mall had crossed a line, quietly, from department store elegance to bare-bones discount retail. Once a mall starts to cross that line, it very rarely crosses back. Outside the walls of Schuylkill Mall, the ground under the entire American shopping model was shifting. Through the second half of the 1990s, Walmart poured into Pennsylvania, opening its enormous single-story supercenters along highway exits from Erie to Bethlehem. A new kind of retail development, called a power center, a strip of large freestanding stores sharing one parking lot beside an off-ramp, no roof between them, was catching on. These new formats stole one of the enclosed mall's most valuable habits, the impulse to swing by after work for a single errand. If you only needed diapers or motor oil, why walk through a football field-length corridor when you could park directly in front of the door you needed? Meanwhile, the region the mall depended on was quietly getting smaller. According to figures from the United States Census Bureau, Schuylkill County's population, which had peaked long before the anthracite collapse, continued its steady decline through the 1990s and 2000s. Every year, a few hundred more young adults left for jobs in the Lehigh Valley, in Harrisburg, or farther afield. The families who stayed were, on average, older, and older shoppers spend less on the specialty stores that keep a mall's middle corridors alive. The ownership of the mall began to change hands as well, and each transfer told its own story. In 2003, Crown American, the company Frank Pasquarilla had built, was absorbed by Pennsylvania Real Estate Investment Trust, based in Philadelphia. Just 4 years later, in 2007, Pennsylvania Real Estate Investment Trust in turn sold Schuylkill Mall to a smaller firm called Empire Realty. Each new owner sat further from the original vision, and each proved less willing to pour capital into a property whose numbers were starting to look uncertain. There were still attempts at fresh blood. Rex Television and Appliance held its position through most of the 2000s, and in October of 2007, a rising discount clothing chain called Steve & Barry's opened a large store inside the mall, drawing a burst of publicity. The excitement did not last. Within less than 2 years, Steve & Barry's had filed for bankruptcy and closed every one of its stores nationwide, leaving another dark storefront behind. By the end of the decade, the cracks had become visible to anyone paying attention. A kiosk stood empty in the middle of the corridor. A specialty shop had begun closing on Sundays, and then on Mondays. A metal security gate stayed pulled halfway down, with a small handwritten sign that simply read, "For lease." Chick-fil-A closed in 2009. The Gap slipped away in early 2012, and in February of 2013, Auntie Anne's, the pretzel counter, whose smell had defined the food court for so many Saturdays, quietly turned off its ovens for the last time. The smell went with it. Management understood, at some level, that something had to be done. In October of 2010, the King's Theater Circuit purchased the old theater space at the end of the mall and began a full rebuild. Over the next 3 years, the company invested serious money into a new complex called Pearl Stadium. 8 modern screens, a 20,000-watt sound system, digital projection, and stadium seating. The centerpiece was a members-only area called the screening room, a 21 and over lounge with leather seats, a full bar, a kitchen, and a screen approaching the scale of a proper cinema. It was exactly the kind of investment that would have made sense in a healthy mall. But a state-of-the-art movie theater, on its own, could not save a building that was quietly hollowing out around it. And what was coming next would test even the most stubborn optimists in Schuylkill County. By 2014, the mall's biggest tenants were fighting national battles that had nothing to do with Frackville. and everything to do with the collapse of a whole era of American retail. And in October of that year, Schuylkill County received the news that had been building for months. Sears, the anchor store that had opened its doors to the very first customers on the morning of October 9th, 1980, was closing. The 10-bay automotive service center at the back of the building went silent. The catalog counter, which had once offered roughly 200,000 items to any farmer or homeowner who wanted them, was cleared out and darkened. The department store that had, more than any other, defined shopping in this region for the better part of a century, simply switched off its lights and left. 4 months later, in February of 2015, Kmart followed. The two chains had been struggling together under the same troubled parent company, Sears Holdings, and the closures at Schuylkill Mall were only two names on a national list that would eventually stretch into the hundreds. For those who had grown up walking the corridor between Sears and Kmart on a Saturday morning, it was as if two of the four corners of the building had suddenly disappeared, leaving the whole structure standing on legs it had never been designed to balance on. The smaller losses arrived with a grim steadiness. In March of 2016, Radio Shack, another dependable American brand caught in its own national bankruptcy, closed its Schuylkill Mall location and pulled its yellow sign down from the storefront. The tenants who remained watched the growing dark spaces along the corridor and did the private math that all merchants do in that situation. How many more months could they hold on before the numbers stopped working? Behind the scenes, the numbers were not working for the owners either. In October of 2016, the company that then held the mall filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy protection, a legal step that essentially declares a property beyond rescue and moves it toward liquidation. In March of 2017, a firm called North Point Development, based in Missouri, purchased the entire 800,000 square foot complex, along with its parking lots and the land beneath them, for $2.1 million. The mall had cost somewhere between $40 and $50 million to build almost 40 years earlier. The new owners had paid something on the order of 1% of that original investment for what was still, on paper, one of the largest buildings in the county. The new owners were not in the mall business. On May 9th of 2017, they made their intentions plain. Every remaining tenant was given 90 days to vacate. The Bon Ton, already quietly planning its own exit under pressure from its struggling parent company, had wrapped up its operations on May 1st of 2017. Walking out from the storefront that had once been Pomeroy's, and before that had been the pride of downtown Pottsville, to walk through Schuylkill Mall in the summer and fall of 2017 was to see something few people ever expect to see with their own eyes. The overhead lights still worked. The tiles still gleamed beneath them. But most of the storefronts were dark, their metal gates pulled all the way down, and there were almost no footsteps in the corridors. Only the muffled hum of the air conditioning that Crown American had once bragged about in the promotional brochures, still doing its job on a building that no longer needed it. A single security guard walked laps past the empty shop fronts. In one corner of the property, tucked away, a medical dialysis center held on to its lease and continued to receive patients. One small, functioning room in an otherwise emptied building. Dunham's Sports, the sporting goods chain that had moved into a vacated anchor space years earlier, chose to fight to the last possible day. Its lights stayed on through the fall of 2017 and into the final week of the year. On December 31st, 2017, with tinsel still hanging in some of the darkened storefronts and no other retailer left along the main run, Dunham's closed its doors. It was the last conventional retail tenant to leave. That left only Pearl Stadium 8, the movie theater rebuilt so lavishly just a few years earlier, still selling tickets in the far corner of the building. A plan to relocate the operation to Pottsville was discussed, but never materialized. On January 15th of 2018, The projectors rolled through their final showing. The last audience shuffled out into the January cold, and the marquee went dark for good. The community responded in the only way it still could, across social media, and especially in the Facebook groups devoted to growing up in Schuylkill County. The posts began pouring in. Old photographs of the fountain, snapshots of long-forgotten storefronts, portraits of employees on their last shift. People wrote their memories in the same tone one might use for a funeral. The mall had by then been dying in public for years, but this was the moment it was formally gone. And yet, for Schuylkill Mall, being gone was not going to be enough. Because a story that had begun with a hilltop being blasted level was about to end the same way. The demolition did not wait. On January 26th of 2018, just 11 days after Pearl Stadium 8 rolled through its final film, the heavy equipment arrived on the hilltop, and the first bulldozers pressed into the walls of the old Sears building at the western end of the mall. From there, over the coming weeks, the demolition worked its way steadily eastward, corridor by corridor, gate by gate, past the empty spot where the fountain had once thrown its small coins of light back at the ceiling. There was one strange, quiet exception to the erasure. In a small back corner of the complex, the medical dialysis center still held a valid lease, and its patients still needed their treatment. So for months during the demolition, that single functioning room remained standing, while the rest of the building came down around it, a mysterious chunk of tile roof and drywall left intact in the middle of a widening field of rubble. Bulldozers worked around it. From the road, if you drove past on Interstate 81 that spring, you could see a small, isolated section of the old mall standing alone in an ocean of broken concrete, still serving the sickest patients in Schuylkill County until their care could be relocated. By the 5th of September, 2018, that final piece was gone. In just over 8 months, 4 decades of retail history in the coal region had been reduced to graded earth. Photographs from the site show what looked less like the remains of a shopping center and more like the aftermath of a natural disaster. A wide brown scar on top of a hill, ringed by the same access roads that had once carried tens of thousands of Saturday shoppers. Then, in the late months of 2019 and into early 2020, the site began to fill in again with something completely different. The developer that had bought the mall had never intended to rebuild retail. Working with the construction firm Clayco, they raised a single, enormous industrial warehouse, an unbroken box of pale panel walls and loading docks, oriented not toward the county, but toward the highway. Public announcements promised more than 800 new jobs in the finished complex, delivered through the language of logistics rather than shopping. Today, if you drive up that access road, what you see is not a mall, and not even the memory of one. You see freight trucks lined up along a loading dock, their engines idling, waiting to be filled with cardboard boxes that will move somewhere else. Most of those boxes belong to the same electronic commerce industry that had, in slow motion over 20 years, pulled the shoppers out of the old corridors in the first place. The fountain, the food court, and the red velvet chair, where Santa Claus had once received children in wet snow boots, all sit, roughly speaking, beneath a diesel-scented apron of freshly paved asphalt. The mall has not been entirely forgotten. In its final years, urban photographers and dead mall enthusiasts from well beyond the region made the drive to Frackville, wandering the empty corridors with cameras and cell phones. Their photographs, gathered in albums on Flickr and in long, slow walkthrough videos on YouTube, drew thousands of views on websites like LabelScar and the online malls and retail wiki. Schuylkill Mall has since become one of the frequently cited case studies for what happened to enclosed shopping malls in the rural northeastern United States. A small, well-documented chapter in a much larger national story. For the people who actually live in Schuylkill County, though, The strangest part of the aftermath is the absence of any formal marker. There is no plaque at the edge of the parking lot. There is no small museum in downtown Pottsville dedicated to the old anchors. There is no memorial for the men and women who worked the perfume counters and the toy aisles and the cash registers for 20 or 30 or 40 years. There is only a smooth steel wall along a highway and a name, Schuylkill Mall Road, still printed on a green street sign that leads to a place no longer worth naming, and downtown Frackville along Lehigh Avenue. The very stretch of storefronts the mall had helped hollow out back in the early 1980s never really came back either. Pomeroy's old flagship building in downtown Pottsville is long gone. In the arithmetic of 40 years of retail change in Schuylkill County, there are no obvious winners. The mall took something from the old downtowns, and then a warehouse took something from the mall, and each transfer left the county's shared public spaces a little smaller than before, which raises the harder question, the one that has been sitting quietly at the edge of this story from the beginning. What exactly died with Schuylkill Mall, and is it dying alone? Stand back from the story of Schuylkill Mall for a moment, and it becomes clear that Frackville was never really alone in what happened here. Across the country, in the same years that the corridors above the coal region were quietly emptying out, the same slow sequence was playing out on other hilltops and in other former farm fields. Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio, was suffering its own long death and would be demolished in stages beginning in the middle of the 2010s. Hawthorne Plaza in Southern California, closed since the 1990s, sat in that strange half-life where it had become more famous as a filming location for post-apocalyptic movies than as a shopping center. Dixie Square Mall outside Chicago, abandoned for decades before it was finally torn down, had already achieved a kind of dark immortality on film. What happened to Schuylkill Mall was not a local tragedy. It was one instrument in a larger symphony, a note being played simultaneously in hundreds of small and mid-sized towns across rural America since the early 2000s. The temptation, in trying to explain all of this, is to reach for a single villain. In the years since electronic commerce came to dominate American shopping, that villain has usually been named as some version of the online marketplace. It is a satisfying explanation, because it is simple, and because there is real truth in it. But the story is much older and much stranger than any single company or technology. The mall in Frackville was already beginning to soften in the middle of the 1990s, before most of its former shoppers had ever heard the word internet used the way we use it today. Its decline was written in a slower hand, using ingredients that had little to do with any one competitor. A shrinking regional population, the disappearance of the industries that had built the middle class here in the first place, young people leaving for jobs somewhere else, shifting tastes that favored casual big-box formats over enclosed corridors, and quietly beneath all of it, a chain of ownership changes, in which each new owner had less reason than the last to invest in a building that was already losing money. Zoom out one more step, and there is something almost unbearably neat about what has happened to this particular piece of land above Frackville. In roughly the space of a century, the anthracite region has lost the two largest public structures that ever organized its daily life. First, over the course of decades, it lost the mines, the collieries and breakers that had employed fathers and grandfathers and knit whole valleys of houses together around a single shift whistle. Then, over the course of another few decades, it lost the mall, the place that had, however imperfectly, tried to knit the county back together around something new. Each of those losses represented a different American century and a different idea of how people should gather. The particular replacement now sitting on that hilltop is a kind of unintended poetry, where shared experience used to happen inside 4 climate-controlled walls. Freight now moves in and out of a warehouse whose entire purpose is to send goods to individual doorsteps. The commerce that once required people to leave their houses and walk past each other for an hour on a Saturday afternoon now requires almost nothing of them at all. Only a screen, a card number, and a signature at a delivery door. Whether that is progress or loss depends, in part, on what you thought the mall was really for. Ask around. Schuylkill County today, though, and it becomes clear that memory has a stubborn kind of survival instinct, all its own. Every time somebody in one of those local Facebook groups posts a scanned photograph from the 1980s, a class portrait in front of the fountain, a birthday party at Chick-fil-A, a mother in a Christmas sweater, standing beside her teenage son at the Hess's entrance, the comments arrive by the hundreds. People still remember the name of the woman at the perfume counter. They still remember the sneakers they were saving for at KB Toys. They still remember who kissed them for the first time outside the theater, which suggests that the mall was giving people something the promotional brochures never quite named. It was giving them, above everything else, a covered public place. A place where strangers passed each other without threat, where the retired mine worker and the teenager and the young mother all shared the same corridor and the same low background music, and where, for a few hours on a Saturday, a whole county could feel like it belonged to something larger than itself. The hardest thing to say about Schuylkill Mall, and about the hundreds of malls that have died alongside it, is that America has not yet found a good replacement for that feeling, not one that is free to enter, not one that is open to everyone, not one that will hold a small town together on a snowy afternoon in February. And that, in the end, may be the real loss on the hilltop above Frackville. Not a building, not even a store, a way of being together, in one place at the same time.